Hello, and welcome to today's short webinar on planning your Microsoft hybrid cloud strategy. My name is Matt Fisher, and thank you for taking the time to spend the next 30 minutes or so with us. If you're viewing the live broadcast and would like to ask any questions, you can type in the Q&A chat window at any time during the webinar, and we'll address a selection of questions at the end. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Livingstone, and I've been working in and around the SAM and ITAM industry since 2004. I'm joined today by my colleague, Simon Luty. Simon is a founder of Livingstone and is our Head of Professional Services. Over recent years, he's been involved in many cloud readiness assessment and cloud migration projects. Simon will be taking us through some of the practical advice later in today's webinar. While I'm sure some of you will know Livingstone well, I'm also aware that some of you won't have heard of us before. As well as being one of the world's largest dedicated providers of software asset management services, we're also the team that did more Microsoft Cloud Readiness Assessments in 2017 and 18 than any other Microsoft partner around the world. That experience puts us in a unique position to help all kinds of organizations to optimize their Microsoft hybrid cloud strategy and software licensing across any platform. Let's start today with a few facts around the state of hybrid cloud adoption globally. First, research from Spiceworks' State of IT 2019 report suggests that the need to upgrade outdated IT infrastructure is the key driver for technology budget increases in 2019. I'm sure many of you can relate to this. It's important, of course, to understand that this also changes the conversation between IT and finance, as there can be perceptions that on-premises infrastructure that's been amortized to the point where it's effectively free can make CFOs reluctant to pay for new infrastructure, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud. Now that said, the latest research does seem to suggest that hybrid cloud, and for the purposes of today's webinar, when we say hybrid cloud, we mean using a mix of cloud-based and on-premise infrastructure and software, does now seem to be the predominant model. In their State of Hybrid Cloud 2018 survey, Microsoft says that 67% of its customers are already using or planning to use hybrid cloud. 54% have moved to hybrid cloud in the last 2 years alone. I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase cloud shock, that moment when a CIO, CFO, or executive has a nasty surprise at just how much their cloud services are costing the organization. So it's not surprising that 84% of organizations say that managing cloud costs is their top priority for 2019. Now this is especially pertinent when you consider that various studies seem to suggest that the average organization wastes between a quarter and a third of their overall cloud spend. It's very easy to do, as some of our examples will show. Now, there are many potential causes for overspend, but one of the main culprits, and something we'll talk about later in more detail, is the habit that many organizations have of simply replicating their on-premises infrastructure and software licensing into the cloud. If you're doing that yourself, I guarantee you are wasting money, and we will show you through the webinar how to make significant savings. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Simon to talk specifically around Microsoft in the cloud.
Thanks, Matt. For those of you who know us, our focus has predominantly been on-premise in the past. And in this changing environment, we understand that there needs to be a new approach. Microsoft is a massive vendor, not only because it represents a big portion of spend on-premise, but they're obviously one of the big hyperscalers in the market. So one of your choices is likely to be a Microsoft choice. Now, we're not particularly focused on Azure only. This will include Microsoft investment across AWS and other cloud providers too, but it's a very different solution. And there are many, many tools that you can buy to try and help you manage on-prem assets. There's a wealth of tools to try and help you manage cloud assets, and we think nobody's really drawing those together effectively. And they do work hand in hand, and it's very important to understand that those investments work together. So, looking at this, what do we consider to be cloud? There aren't two extremes in this environment. If you were to ask me my experience, 5% of the customers we speak to are totally anti-cloud. Maybe 5% are thinking about migrating the entire environment in a short period of time. And that 90% in the middle are either going to take a long time to do it, or they're always going to retain a hybrid environment. Some stuff on-prem, some stuff up in the cloud. And then obviously there's going to be a multitude of providers in the cloud across IaaS, PaaS, and software as a service as well. So that represents the hybrid opportunity for us. If this is a 3 to 5 year journey, well, you're definitely going to be in hybrid for those 3 to 5 years. And even after that 5 years, you'll probably find that you still retain some kind of on-premises investments as well. So let's take a quick look on-prem. One of the things you're going to need to prep for is your agreement. So having a look at how these agreements work is obviously a very, very important thing you're going to need to prepare for. So getting the counts right is a byproduct of the work that we do. We're predominantly focused on optimization, but understanding how you're licensing SQL, Windows, across virtualized environments, really complex areas like high availability and active-passive clustering, standard stacking. These are all things that are still very, very complicated and need to be taken into consideration. But what you're also going to have to take into consideration is how am I licensing my cloud environment to? Because there are certain benefits and bring your own license options that now you're probably going to have leveraged across your agreements with Microsoft, but you're actually consuming them outside of your current infrastructure on premise. So the counts are still very, very important. But what's more important is thinking about optimization. So what we're looking at here is a very sophisticated view on how we try and increase efficiency on premise. When we start looking at cloud, you'll find it's exactly the same set of data, but we think there's good opportunity to try and shrink your data center. And what we're looking at here is a view of Windows as these are SQL servers. We're actually looking at CPU, memory, disk, IOPS utilization, how hard the hardware is working, to see how much you're using that software. These products are licensed on procs and cores, and we're finding out that people are using less than 10% of some of those hardware attributes. So that investment can be reduced or optimized in a certain way. And that is something that we really think has been lacking. A lot of people have focused on metering products on desktops, and now we're using this really sophisticated method to look at trying to do that on your server environment as well. Thinking about virtualization. So SQL is probably one of the biggest investments you'll have across a Microsoft platform. And how you virtualize that product has a profound impact on how you need to buy it. And we're finding that by looking at private cloud clusters, so max virtualized host clusters, there's a massive savings opportunity that doesn't involve things like consolidation or trying to wind down servers. So what that's doing is it's looking at how you virtualize across your environment, how much capacity you have within your physical clusters, and then where you should be placing some of that SQL server. Now, what you'll find is if you're sprawling across multiple clusters, you could be missing out on massive efficiencies by putting that on 1 or 2 clusters. And what you also need to think about is how do I monitor the change? So if I'm going to invest in either re-architecting or moving my SQL servers onto physical hosts, how do I make sure people aren't deploying outside of those hosts? So what Anywhere is designed to do is capture change. Every time a new SQL server enters your environment, we're going to catch it. You're going to be able to get on top of it before you hit the true up. Because the worst thing you want to do is go and invest and then find out 2 or 3 years later that you've injected a ton of servers outside of your max virtualized hosts. And those now need to be licensed, and that's a nasty surprise and an inefficient investment that you're going to make. We do exactly the same thing for Windows. And if you think about this, we're focusing on Microsoft, but because we're reading the attributes at the server, any product that is deployed on those servers that is governed or licensed by a proc or a core is potentially going to be subject to the optimization that we're thinking about for Windows servers. So everything that's deployed on these boxes that's based on props and cores could potentially be reduced. And this is just focused on-premise right now. We haven't even started at looking at opportunities to migrate to the cloud. So again, by reading these characteristics and thinking about virtual hardware, physical hardware, how much you're using the attributes which basically dictate the licensing models, we're starting to look at opportunities to shrink that environment. If we can remove a host from a virtual cluster because it's running at 30%, and that increases to 40%, that's a reduction in ESX boxes, VMware licenses, Microsoft licenses, as well as the physical hardware. So although we're thinking predominantly about Livingstone Anywhere for Microsoft, the byproduct is looking at other software as well as infrastructure investments and using exactly the same data to try and optimize those investments because we're reading those hardware characteristics of the server. So in terms of our opportunities to support customers in optimizing their data center, this is a brand new opportunity for us, and it's that sophisticated data platform that allows us to give a much more sophisticated set of optimization recommendations. Okay, so let's get out of the on-prem environment and start thinking about how we optimize the cloud. What do we mean by optimize the cloud? You need to understand whether this is a good or bad idea. One of the reasons that we back a hybrid environment is because it might not be the best idea to move everything right now. When does cloud become compelling? Well, cloud becomes compelling when you're about to spend money. If you're in year 2 of a 7-year depreciation cycle, having a cost conversation is actually going to be quite challenging for us to have because you are in that depreciation model for the next 6 or 5 years. However, having access to the data so you can align it to every single infrastructure and software investment that you have allows you to make decisions over the period of a subscription because these things will be fluid. It's easy to plan up front for your big investments, but for some of your, there's going to be ad hoc investments whereby you're still going to need this data too. So what are we looking at on screen? This is a full Azure sizing exercise. And what you're looking at is the different cost opportunities of looking at your on-prem environment as it would be replicated to the cloud. And we have options to do a lift and shift cost model. So we read the characteristics of your server and we show you what they look like in the cloud. That's the green bar, by the way, on the bar chart. The blue bar is once we've read those utilization statistics, CPU, memory, disk, and IOPS. And as you can see, it's considerably smaller. Because when you move to the cloud, you don't need to take forward your massive overhead. You can run things a lot hotter, and compute can be burstable. Then we need to think about discounts associated to software assurance and the potential for reserved instances. But you're going to need a mix of all of those different models because it won't work for every single workload. Across the bottom, we're looking at all the additive options. One of the worst things about planning for cloud is where you miss something. So if you're not planning for premium storage and you miss that cost, it's a considerable investment. If you're planning on using backup services and that's not part of your business case, those costs can escalate quite quickly. So what are the preventative ways in which we're trying to help you plan better and avoid cloud shock, as Matt called it, is to make sure that you've got good, accurate data to build your plans on. You can then allocate workloads to this data, and you can look at price by price, workload by workload, how to plan my move to the cloud, and where does this start to make sense for my business. And this is obviously not just Azure focus, we can do this for AWS as well. How about all the rest of the software that I've got deployed? What if I don't know how to build a workload map? Well, obviously Livingstone has great expertise with a catalog to help you recognize licensable software applications. And what you're looking at on screen is a view of a particular product and what the number of cores are that you need in the cloud, the blue bar on the left, and then how many cores you might need, what blue bars on-prem and green's in the cloud. So you can see there's going to be a reduction in the number of cores or procs on the vast majority of the servers that you move because you don't need to carry forward the inefficiency. So again, we're going to start to look at all the other cost opportunities associated to other products. And what you'll also find is there might be an alternative in the cloud. So how do we try and take these applications that you're running on-premise and potentially look at lift and shift options, but are there any cloud alternatives from these hyperscalers or SaaS alternatives that you could choose and immediately move towards that type of model? So this is really combining all of that data on-prem, those applications, how they're licensed, and what they would look like in the cloud, to again build a very robust plan and include all of the cost-saving opportunities, not just the ones that sit front and center like, hardware and storage type costs. Okay, let's think about some of that Microsoft investment that you've been making for the last decade. Do I need to carry software assurance on Windows? How much do I need to carry? What we're able to do is look at how you license on-premise, which is very likely to be data center heavy, because that's how you do max virtualization, and then give you a view of what your environment might look like in the cloud. And we can do this in planning phase. Data center and standard cores basically mean almost exactly the same thing in the cloud in terms of how many cores and VMs you get to run. The big difference being data center allows you to run on-prem and in the cloud. But if you're going to move half of your infrastructure to the cloud, that means you probably don't need half the licensing on-premise. So do you need to convert some of those data center licenses into standard? Is that a more cost-effective model for you to prepare for a true-up or renewal? And is it beneficial? Am I going to save money by maintaining my software assurance? And how much is that going to save me? Also, how much is it going to cost? Because if I'm just planning for a hub, but I'm not including the cost for the software assurance on Windows, it's not a full TCO. It's not a full cost model that includes all of the things that you need to take into consideration. And that's very, very important. This will all relate back to what you put on that EA, by the way, or your Microsoft agreement, and how you maintain software assurance. So at the point of true-up and renewal, it's very important to make sure you're planning. Because if you put the wrong products on your EA and you start to migrate in year one, it's very likely you're going to carry a huge amount of wastage and surplus in years 2 and 3. And these are all things that are easy for us to avoid. Those cost savings should be paying for the migration. This reduction in software spend, as well as hardware, should actually feed into the migration budget. If you start modernizing twice, if you will. Okay, let's have a look at the SQL side of things, and this varies from provider to provider. When we were thinking about Windows, there's obviously quite a profound difference between Azure and AWS. You can bring your own license in Azure hybrid usage benefit for Azure, but you certainly can't do that in AWS unless you're thinking about dedicated hosts, which might be an opportunity, and therefore you don't need to carry software assurance. So tons of complexity that you need to take into consideration when you're making plans about which hyperscaler you want to go with, and how much stuff you'll want to put there and how much software assurance you're going to have to retain on your agreement. If you're going on-prem to cloud for AWS, you're likely going to be reducing software assurance on Windows at some point, and we want to make sure you plan that properly. Because again, those cost savings should be injected into your business case to support an innovation in terms of move to cloud. SQL, you can bring licenses to both environments. This is really focusing on BYOL, bring your own license, in terms of carrying software assurance on SQL. There is your hybrid usage benefit, by the way. On IaaS, it basically will let you run it in a cloud environment. So what we're measuring here is what does my environment look like on-prem, and what would it look like in the cloud? I don't know whether you can see the detail. The top view is enterprise service, and it's actually telling me that I might need more cores to run in the cloud if I want to retain the same performance. And that might be a throttle on RAM, not on CPUs, but bring your own license for SQL is going to be based on the number of cores irrespective. So this is an example where if you want to retain the same performance and the same specification, you actually need more cores in the cloud than you need on premise. And in the standard example just below, it's actually showing you less cores. We'll often find that it's a reduction in cores, but again, it might be an increase, and that's something you need to plan for, because that might not be the best asset for you to move. Or if you do want to move it and bring your own license, be prepared that you're going to have to increase the licensing if you want to carry that as your hybrid usage benefit. There are other more sophisticated things to think about in software assurance benefits for SQL. You're also going to have to take into consideration things like managed instances and how you apply that to PaaS. Those are all things that we can help with, but it's slightly more sophisticated than what you can automate with data. So SQL's a big area, represents a massive investment. We've already looked at ways that we can try and reduce your counts on premise, but we also want to make sure that we're planning for the cloud, whether that be good or bad. Is there a savings opportunity here, or am I going to incur more cost as I go through that migration? Okay, So let's say you've used Anywhere, you've got all the data you need for the migration. You've gone through the migration and it's been successful. Well, the cloud's a very different environment. And although it's a new way for you to consume compute, your environment changes on a very regular basis. And within Anywhere, we're actually able to monitor those changes in specifications and consumption. But what we're thinking about now is, where does this $60 billion worth of overspend come in infrastructure as a service? If I'm paying as I go, how on earth am I able to overspend once I hit the public cloud? Well, it's very easy. No one's going to tell you not to do it, and you can run whatever you like in the public cloud. You're just going to end up paying for how much you use. That means that you could certainly be using more than you actually needed, which is a really big area that we think is a massive opportunity. So let's think about an Azure and an AWS investment in exactly the same way that we're thinking about your on-prem investment. Well, we already know how to size assets. We know that from the two-cloud environment. And now what we need to work out is how do I do that in the cloud? So let's look at the green bar. That's what I'm spending today, but I've realized now that I've over-provisioned. I've either moved workloads or changed something, and now I'm over-provisioned. I can reduce my VM sizes, which is going to provide an immediate cost saving. The good thing about the cloud is we don't need to wait for an investment milestone for you to save the money. If you make a change today, you start spending less money tomorrow, which means if you don't make that change, you're wasting money every single day. But that's why we're designing these solutions, to try and make it a slightly easier decision. And then if I've got all this software assurance I've been applying, am I making sure that I tick the right boxes once it hits Azure or AWS? If I've got AHub for Windows and I'm paying all that money on premise, but I've got instances that are running in the cloud, but they haven't applied an Azure hybrid usage benefit, I'm basically spending 40% too much. So what we're doing here is we're running the same technology to collect those utilization statistics. We're integrating with Azure and AWS through API. We're comparing inventory and billing information about what's being consumed on each instance, comparing that against our recommended future state, and then providing a cost-based model that shows you what those cost opportunities would be. So this is a view about in-cloud. What are we talking about? Right-sizing, licensing, applying the right levels of discount if you have them. Would reserved instances work for you? What's the cost implication of doing that? Where have I applied it and where haven't I applied it? For any of those who are in the public cloud right now, you would have thought it would be quite easy to find out how many servers at a summary view you've got AHub applied to, or where you're renting SQL, where you bring your own license. It's actually quite complicated, and we're trying to break through that complexity and break it down into a nice, easy to manage dashboard. So there's the summary view. What does it look like at a micro level? Well, we're going to provide you a recommendation server by server about current size, what that size should be, everywhere you haven't applied AHub that could, and everywhere that you haven't applied a reserved instance that could. We're also heavily focused on SQL, because now that you're deploying SQL potentially across 2 hyperscalers, if you don't have discovery in that area, that's an investment that you're supposed to be covering through your licensing agreements, and currently you don't have access to that data. So that's a big area where again, we're seeing risk being introduced into organizations, but massive cost savings opportunities through right-sizing those boxes and making sure they're fully efficient. Okay, I think this is my final use case. Thinking about Office 365. A lot of people will have bought it. Some people will be using it more than others or be on that migration journey. But Office 365, as we know, is an in-cloud motion. This is software as a service. Now, it's quite difficult to be non-compliant. Anybody who's been managing Microsoft licenses, over the last decade would probably know you could run into a lot of problems on the wrong editions of Office deployed. It used to be a massive compliancy issue. Well, that compliancy issue has disappeared, and now you can't really be non-compliant with Office 365. But you can sure as hell overuse. So what that means is, you might not be compliant, but you can certainly overspend. You can buy too much and not get the full benefit from it. But now that it's up in the cloud and it relates back to a desktop product, what's being used with Office, how do we try and bring all these data points together? Maybe I'm using some online services, some on-prem services. Well, Anywhere's designed to find out how much productivity tools you're using, whether that be Office, SharePoint, Skype, Exchange, and identify opportunities to right-size those profiles. So what that means is, this is an example where we're looking at everybody's got an E5 because we think everyone needs an E5. But it turns out half the people don't have that enabled, so they can have an E3. A few of those people don't use Office, so they could use an E1 or an F1, and some people are just using Office. There's going to be test accounts in your portal, and they might have E3s, full editions, if you've only got that on your agreement. What we're doing is we're basing recommendations about right-sizing user profiles based on factual usage of features and functionality. Okay, how do we try and pull this together? We've got tons of recommendations, on-prem, to cloud, in cloud. Every day, every week, something changes. Well, Anywhere has a functionality built in that triggers you on every change or compelling event that's going on with your environment. If a SQL server drops below 10%, we'll trigger it. If we find a new SQL server being deployed outside those max virtualized clusters, we'll find it. If there's a right-sizing opportunity, this is where you find that information. E5 to E3, this is where that recommendation exists. So they're all categorized and broken down into a nice, easy-to-consume format. And this would be, the daily spot where you come and find out what's going on within your environment and all the recommendations that need to be followed up on. And this, this engine's where we're trying to pull that entire hybrid environment together, which, as you can imagine, is a huge volume of data and complexity. Okay, so let's wrap up before I pass it back to Matt. What are we recommending here? You do need to create a full baseline and optimization of your on-premise Microsoft software. And if you're just using discovery tools, it's not enough, and there's a lot of sophisticated opportunities that could drive savings for you on-premise. You do need to evaluate and plan the cost and risk of moving to the cloud. Multi-cloud, or the particular one that you've chosen, you need to include the licensing as part of that. They go hand in hand. What about all of those options? What about the stuff that's going to stay on-prem? Now, let's build a robust plan based on your business requirements, not just because we think the cloud's a good idea. Understand the licensing conditions. We're focused on Microsoft today, but how about the rest of your products? Are you creating a risk? If you just go and throw an Oracle database into Azure, you're going to have a lot of problems when you come around to an audit. So do understand those licensing conditions, as well as some of the benefits around the investments that you've been making for the last 10 or 15 years in software assurance. Build IaaS instances based on what you need, not based on what you've built. You're going to end up either not moving forward with the project because the budget or the plan is so inflated. So let's use those utilization statistics, the same ones that we're using to optimize on-prem, to actually create a more accurate and optimal plan for what you need in the cloud. Once you've moved there, things will still change. You'll still be making changes. You'll still be amending workloads and changing applications. That's all going to have a prolific impact on how you're consuming compute and storage. When those changes happen, make sure you react. Make sure you right-size and get those immediate savings. Pretty soon, vast majority of people are going to be on O365. If you're just on an E3 or an E5 everywhere, I have to say it might not be based on factual data. So let's look at those opportunities to try and reduce some of those profiles, or right-size them, or do some cleansing on that O365 portal. These things change every day. When you're in a hybrid scenario, those opportunities are immediate, like I mentioned. You're not only going to be changing on-prem, you'll be changing assets in cloud and moving things between those two environments, and potentially across multiple cloud providers. So having ability to try and stay on top of what's changing is very, very important. And actually having an ability to distill that down into a distinct set of recommendations can sometimes be overwhelming when it's based on the data. So there's big risks, but massive opportunities in this new hybrid world. And with that, I'll sort of hand back to Matt.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. So as you saw on the last sort of 20 minutes or so, Simon was referring to quite a lot of screenshots there. All of that data is coming from a solution that we're bringing to market very soon called Livingstone Anywhere for Microsoft. Now, the point of today's presentation is not to sell you that solution. It was to hopefully impart some value and advice on your hybrid cloud strategy, which I hope we've achieved. But if you're interested in understanding how Anywhere might help you optimize your hybrid cloud strategy, we'd love to show you the product in action. Thank you to those of you that have submitted questions through the last 20 minutes or so. There's too many for us to actually answer here live, but we'll take a selection and we'll answer the other ones offline. But Simon, if you're primed and ready to go, I've got some questions for you. Go ahead. So the first one is that I'm currently in the first year of a 3-year agreement isn't this a little bit difficult for me to actually save some money?
It's a very good question, and it's one that we come across all the time. The worst thing you can do is come and speak to us 3 months before the end of the 3-year term, because we're looking at something more sophisticated than getting your accounts right. We're thinking about reducing server footprint, cloud opportunities. These are things that take effort and time, and optimization should be an everyday occurrence. You shouldn't just be waiting for the term to find out whether you've got an opportunity. It's often too late. So we would talk to anybody wherever they are in those terms, because you're always going through that fluctuation and change. And if you're investing in cloud, it brings a lot of levers to pull with those publishers, because they're very interested in trading up, classic licensing revenue for what might be cloud revenue.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. The next one is, my organization is not yet fully invested in the cloud. How could you help me build a business case for moving certain workloads or assets into the cloud?
Okay. So there's a very important thing when thinking about the cloud, because when you speak to the people trying to sell it to you, they will tell you it's the best thing for your business. What we need to do is align to drivers, okay? So anytime you have an investment milestone, hardware refresh, outsourced contract, you're replacing a storage appliance, your DR facility, your licensing agreements, whatever ones they might be, those are all compelling events where this data might become meaningful to you. So what we need to understand is, when do those compelling events hit, and then what's the alternative cloud potential environments look like? And that's where those cases come in. Now, what you'll find is, if there's a compelling case, you need to invest in more investigation. And obviously, if it doesn't look like it's a great case, then on-premise is right for your business. We're fundamentally wedded to the fact that this is a hybrid environment.
Yeah. Okay. And the final one that I'm going to put to you today is, obviously we've spent the last half an hour talking specifically around Microsoft Hybrid Cloud. Obviously Microsoft isn't the only vendor trying to encourage its customers to go towards the cloud. So the other question, or the last question we have, is, what about non-Microsoft vendors?
Of course, yeah. Now, we touched on it very briefly. Understanding what's deployed on the box is going to be an essential part of wherever you put that box. And what we're trying to encourage here is, most people are really focused on infrastructure comparisons, and they're forgetting that their VMware contract or Symantec contract or IBM contract is going to look totally different once they've migrated to public cloud. So absolutely, you need to focus on the rest of the software, and you need access to clean data about what's deployed on those assets. That will allow you to understand what those cost savings opportunities would be. The other very important thing you need to work out is, am I allowed to run this product in the cloud? So deep in the terms of the ULAs and the product terms, you'll find that some of these products can be hosted and some of them cannot, and it would be a shame for you to ruin $1 million cost-saving opportunity by introducing a $5 million software litigation risk.
And that's especially true on some of the older legacy vendors, right?
Absolutely, yes. And often true of people competing with Microsoft and AWS.
Yeah, excellent. Good. Well, thank you for sharing your pearls of wisdom there, Simon. That brings the webinar to a close. I hope that you've found it both informative and interesting. And of course, we'd love to talk to you more about your hybrid cloud strategy. So if it looks like something you'd like to talk about more, please do get in contact. But for now, we'll let you get on with the rest of your day.